Greetings, everyone. I'm Adrian Hockstedt, CEO for the Veterinary Medical Association Executives. On behalf of AVMA, that's our acronym, and your Veterinary Medical Association, which invited you, I'd like to welcome you to this month's episode of Veterinary Practice Health. This is a monthly speaker series delivering insights to help you build a healthier veterinary practice. Thank you for making time in your busy schedule to participate today. Before we begin, I'd like to do a quick sound check to make sure everybody can hear me and see the Veterinary Practice Health slide on your screen. If both are working for you, please click the raise hand icon in your Zoom panel. Excellent. Looks like we're all set. During the webinar, all attendee microphones are muted. At any time during the presentation, you may ask a question by using the question dialog box on your Zoom control panel. The webinar is being recorded for on-demand access and will be available online Monday. We'll email you the link to the recording along with an evaluation form. Our topic today is highlights from the AVMA Business and Economics Forum for those of you who did not have a chance to attend this great two-day program last fall. We are joined by Dr. Clinton Neal. Dr. Neal is a senior economist and associate director for strategic business research and outreach at the American Veterinary Medical Association. His role is to assist in translating the work of the AVMA Veterinary Economics Division and various stakeholders into actionable items for veterinary teams and clinics. He also holds a part-time appointment as assistant professor in veterinary economics for the Cornell Center of Veterinary Business and Entrepreneurship. His research focuses on a broad scope of issues facing veterinary medicine. Welcome, Dr. Neal, and I will now turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. As I get ready to share my screen here, I just want to say it's great to see everybody and glad to be here. As Adrian pointed out, my name is Dr. Clint Neal, and I'm a senior economist and associate director at AVMA in the economics division. And we had a really great time back in October at the AVMA Business and Economic Forum. I'm a bit new to the profession here. Or to AVMA, I should say. I've been with the profession for a while, and I didn't do a whole lot at the AVMA Economics and Business Forum this past year other than help facilitate it to happen. My wonderful colleagues in the division actually have done all the work, and I'm just here to highlight all of what they have been doing and what they talked about back in October. So let's get started. A quick kind of outline of what we're going to talk about today, and with a different components about, everything going on in the macroeconomy. We'll talk a little bit about pet and service demand within the industry. We'll talk about the market for education and veterinary education, the market for veterinarians themselves and how that has changed, salary updates, all of that kind of stuff. And then we'll talk about various workforce initiatives that AVMA is working on. And then we'll give you some key takeaways as we move forward through that. And let's jump right into the macroeconomic piece, because that's the one that I have been asked a lot of questions about over the last year, even before I was at AVMA. And there's a lot of back and forth about what is the macroeconomy going to look like in 2023. And that's a rather difficult question to answer at this point, but because there's a lot of indicators to watch. We do watch inflation, and everybody's probably felt the squeeze of prices, and even at the grocery store, how all of that has really affected how we spend our money and all of those different types of things. But it's also affecting the cost of doing business, right? So you've probably all actually saw increases in your supplies and the different biologicals and pharmaceuticals, parasiticides, all of that has increased. And so inflation is one of the things we watch and has been the biggest thing that we do get a lot of attention and media attention about, but it's not the only thing we want to talk about. It's also about new jobs, real wages, unemployment, housing, buying and selling, and people getting their first home, also building new houses. All of those things are really good indicators of the health of the economy. Also, things around obviously GDP growth, or gross domestic product growth, consumer confidence and consumer savings, right? And disposable income. All of those things play into what's going on. But this kind of busy graph that I have up here is done by the Conference Board and is quite busy, but looks at all of these different indicators and says, where's the economy headed? And where they think we're headed is that we're possibly heading into a recession into 2023. If it is a recession, which they're not saying it is, but recessions are always backwards looking. We try to predict them, but we never know if they happen until, 2 to 3 quarters later. But there's a lot of indicators that say the economy is slowing down, which it was running hot and it needed to kind of come back down from everything that happened during the pandemic, but likely going into a recession in 2023, but probably a really mild one just to continue that cool down process to get us right back on track after all of the disruptions we had over the past few years. But those are some of the things we're thinking about. And so it's really important as business owners and being part of a small business for a lot of people in the veterinary medicine industry is to really think about how is that going to affect me personally? And then also how do we take that into account as we make decisions coming into the next year? When we look at consumer confidence, though, this is a measure that I like to look at because this is where consumers think about and report about what they think is going to happen in 6 months in terms of their income, their job prospects, other business information, and business fluctuations and things like that. What we actually see here is that obviously in 2020, we saw a big decline from the pandemic and this kind of micro recession that we went through due to the COVID-19 virus. What we then see is kind of this bouncing back in 2021, but have been on a general decline since 2022, kind of seeing some bouncing up and down here in the last few months. But generally, consumer confidence is down and has been on a decline. Will that continue into 2023 or not? I think is actually going to be very dependent on if we end up in a recession and then how deep of a recession we get into. Like I said, most predictions are for a very mild recession just to continue to get us back on track post-pandemic time. But the other thing we like to look at, and that I kind of mentioned before, was inflation. When we look at inflation within veterinary medicine specifically, and we're looking at veterinarian services, so this is actual veterinary services, they call it veterinarian services at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what we actually see is these large price increases that happened over 2022 and towards the end of 2021 and really into 2022, we saw prices really rise very quickly. And if you look at from January 2022 to December 2022, what we actually saw was an increase of about 13 to 14% in prices, which is far more than what we were seeing before, even back, if we look back before the pandemic and during 2020 and most of 2021, we're looking more at like an annual change in prices of about 3 to 5%. And now we're seeing much more, 2 to 3 times that. And so it's important to think about, a lot of that has happened because cost of goods to actually operate a veterinary practice changed, right? Those increased. And so a lot of that is a reflection of this, but it's important to think about how is that affecting the industry? What's that going to look like for 2023? We've seen some flattening in the last few months of these price changes, which is a good sign, but that could change again, given, what's happening in this new year and what's going to happen with the macroeconomy. So that's kind of your general overview of the macro piece. But what we always like to talk about, what everybody wants to know, right, is where are the pets? Where's the demand for our services? And then what does that look like as we talk about the service market and efficiencies and things like that? When we look at the demand for veterinary services, in particular routine care, we see that it's been very uneven if we look over the last year, where some places actually saw a really big increase in vaccine sales. And while other places saw really negative or really big declines in vaccine sales over the last year. What we do see, what I'd like to point out though, is that most of this is pretty flat, right? That there wasn't a huge change from 2021 into 2022. If there was, it was really slight declines or slight increases, but it's super uneven. And it's really about what is going on in your area, and the macroeconomy is going to affect that, and how all of those things matter. And so it's really important to think about when you're thinking about how do we adjust for this really uncertain future of 2023 and the macroeconomy. It's really important to look at what's happening in your local area, doing your due diligence to think about how that's changing and those types of things. So really uneven geographically of what's going on, and again, just keeping in mind what's happening in your area and using that to help you make decisions for this year. But one of the things that when we look retrospectively, the big talk was about a pet adoption boom over in 2020 to 2021. And what we actually see here is that there definitely was an uptick in pet adoptions between spring 2020 and spring 2021. So mostly adoptions over 2020. But what we actually see is that uptick was kind of an anomaly, and we've seen a lot of people, a lot more surrenders happening. Shelters are full, and they're not getting pets adopted as quickly as they were before, in 2020, 2021. And so we're still seeing this fluctuation and these changing pet demographics over time that have really caused some more uncertainty as we move into 2023. I think this is leveling out as we see a lot of that's happening, but the macroeconomy can change things. People may not be able to feel like they can afford veterinary care or afford to own a pet anymore. And I think we're seeing some of that effect with all the price increases and things like that. But they're definitely, these numbers are relatively new, and there were some corrections in these numbers from last year when we got this update in 2021. There was a much bigger bump in pet adoptions or estimated pet adoptions, and this has kind of come down some. So definitely an uptick, but we are seeing some leveling out and changing as we move into more uncertainty in the economy. When we look at the pet market more specifically, and I noticed a question here where increased prices followed by increased profits. I think we did see some of that. We kind of see that number reflected in this revenue number that was still positive for most of 2022. And this is I pulled these numbers from VetSource, which is and their veterinary industry tracker, which is in conjunction with AVMA. What we see is that visits have declined really over the last year on the rate of about 3.5% to 4%. That number fluctuates a little bit because it's rolling average from week to week. But what we see is that a lot of those visits are down compared to 2021. We do see that obviously because, as we can see from those pet adoption numbers and number of households owning pets, that has come down from the pandemic highs. And revenues are still positive. So part of this is price increases. Part of this is people and pet owners and clients buying more services per pet. And so it is a mix of those things, but I suspect some of that, a good portion of that is also for those price increases. So revenue wise, that is up from these price increases, but profits are harder to get at because costs are a little bit harder to capture here. But I suspect that these revenues are reflecting those price increases and also kind of playing into some increased profits, or probably level profits for a lot of people. When we look at services though, and how this has changed from, going from the pandemic and the pandemic highs, one of the things we measure, we've started measuring here at the AVMA, one of my colleagues, is efficiency. And while we talk about efficiency and it's like, oh, there's more efficient practices than other ones, it's important to remember when we talk about efficiency and we put these into different categories about low efficiency versus moderate versus high, the reality is that most veterinary practices are actually relatively efficient. And that when we say low, it's just we're categorizing. Nobody's in a negative or a red zone or something we should be concerned about, or very few people are. And so what we actually see is these different levels of efficiency, people just being able to produce a little bit more than some of their counterparts. And what we actually see on the companion animal side is that most people kind of fall into this high efficiency or moderate efficiency realm. Very few people even fall under the 70% efficient in relative terms, which again is still very high. So just to give you some caveats here, but we're going to look at some statistics that kind of correlate with those people that fall in that high efficiency category versus moderate versus low, and kind of how they're operating a business. And you can kind of look at and compare what does that mean and all those things. The other piece about efficiency that I want to mention is that when we talk about efficiency, we're talking about utilizing your staff appropriately. We're talking about utilizing your resources and your capital appropriately, so that as long as those things are working really well together, you know, you're being really efficient with those resources. That's really what we're talking about here. And that kind of brings us to this first polling question that we're going to throw at you here. And so in the most efficient practices, and that's what we call our best practices, before I give you this answer here in a minute, how many hours a day, Monday through Friday, are veterinarians able to see scheduled appointments? So hours a day to see scheduled appointments. We're going to get into this in a little bit, but I like seeing all the answers. Everybody's kind of like, oh, I don't know. Is it 6? Is it 7? Is it 8 or 9? Got some variation in those responses. So good to know, and good to see you kind of taking a guess at that. And we'll get it into it here very shortly. But let's start off with just how many hours a day are our most efficient practices actually operating. And what we're actually seeing is that many of them operate. All right, the polling question keeps popping up on my screen here. Most are operating 9 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and 3 hours on Saturday, which we don't actually see a lot of variation between the different levels of efficiency here. But the best practices are keeping it the high efficiency practices are keeping it very consistent Monday through Friday. They're all operating about 9 hours and then 3 hours on Saturday. And a lot of them aren't even operating on Sunday. And so that's showing that efficiency change and things like that. They're utilizing their staff and resources just slightly differently on how many hours a day they're actually going to be open and taking clients. So here's the answer to our poll question. The majority of respondents, the largest majority of, or a third of y'all, said 7 hours a day, and that is where the best practices lie. The highly efficient practices keep about 7 hours a day available for veterinarians to see patients and schedule appointments. So 7 hours a day is great. That is what we have seen here. And we actually see some differences in this, in the sense that, you know, your lower efficient practices, your moderate efficient practices are varying more from day to day, whereas the high efficient practices are really consistent across the week. And I think that consistency plays a role, not only in efficiency, but also in team well-being and things like that, to keep everybody on a consistent schedule, while other people might vary a bit. So holding 7 hours a day shows to be really highly efficient. When we look at the staff and what they do to get things settled and ready to go for veterinarians to actually see patients, what we see is that the staff in the most highly efficient practices actually almost always use 2 hours a day to get things settled for those veterinarians before they even walk in the door. So that's saying that utilizing your staff to get everything ready to go so that you can be really efficient when patients start coming in the door is a really key point here. And again, we see that, the lower efficiency practices and the moderate efficiency practices, they tend to vary a little bit more. Those moderate efficiency practices are just slightly less, but having that variation over day to day is what's causing some of that loss in efficiency. And then 2 hours a day seems to be pretty optimal before people get in the door. And so that's just something interesting that I found here was, being really consistent every day, getting things settled as well as working a set number of hours is proven to be really efficient. And again, everybody is relatively efficient here. Nobody's in a danger zone or anything like that, but just consistency helps bump that efficiency even more. Now, management tasks delegated to the appropriate staff members. So how much of the owner's time is allocation between practice management and interaction with clients? Typically, we see that those that are seeing clients more as a practice owner tend to be in that higher efficiency range, right? So delegation and management and giving people autonomy, as well as making sure that all of those responsibilities are being taken care of, is an important piece of getting that little bit more efficiency bump. And they're really, again, this varies quite a bit, but it's all about balance and delegation, and what works for your practice might not work for another practice. But good to keep all of that in mind as we think about how to bump our efficiency just a little bit more to help with the other strains on our day and those types of things. So allocating your time appropriately, utilizing your staff, and really concentrating on the amount of time available for the veterinarians in the practice to actually see patients has proven to be really, as long as you're being consistent in those things, has really shown to be important in increasing efficiency. So that's kind of wrapping up some stuff about the pet market, as well as veterinary services, all the things that we've looked at and talked about at the Economic Summit. And there's a lot more detail on both of those things that I'm giving you here today. This is really just the high level overview that I wanted to throw at you here. But let's jump into the market for education. Oops, one too many. So when we look at the market for education, so this is all the graduating seniors from the various veterinary schools and the US colleges across the states. Over 44% of all graduates tend to join companion animal, with 27.4% going into an internship. 3/4 of that, the numbers going into internships, are actually in companion animal of some sort. And so we actually see that a large portion of students are going into companion animal, and that tends to grow over time from year to year. But we've got a 8.6% going into mixed practice. We've got about 3% going into food animal, and about a little over 1%, 1 to 2% going into equine. And then we've got all of our other public groups in that as well. There is a large portion, about 12%, that we don't know, that we call unknown, because they didn't fully respond to the surveys that get sent out by AVMC, or they just didn't respond at all. But this is about 12% of our respondents. What we find is that when we follow up later with the colleges about some of these numbers, we tend to see the same percentages. And so if we were to distribute that, it wouldn't really change the percentages here. But just as a note, as we try to be as transparent as possible when we talk about these numbers. Now, the number of graduates securing positions in companion animal and internship obviously are inversely correlated. The more people you have going into internships, the less people you have going into directly into practice. And so we've seen this kind of trend happening over the last few years, where a lot more people are going directly into companion animal practice and less into internships. And most of them actually end up receiving offers, right? Offers have really increased. Veterinarians aren't having a hard time getting a job, even our new veterinarians. And so what we have seen is this kind of decline in people pursuing internships over time. Will that change as the economy changes? How will that change? We did see that a lot of that shift during the Great Recession back in 2007 through 2009. And that may change a little bit again, but a lot of people are going straight into clinical practice, which is an important thing to think about. When we look at these other types of practices, in particular, when we looked at mixed practice and food animal and equine, for those of you working in those spaces, which are also near and dear to my heart, coming from a rural background, what we actually see is that these students pursuing these types of practice have really been flat over time, maybe some slight declines in food animal and some slight inclines in recent years with mixed, but mostly has stayed flat over the last 10 years, and we're not expecting that to change too much. It might change a bit with certain schools coming online that are pursuing more heavy food animal focus and recruiting students from that perspective. So these numbers will be interesting to watch over the next decade, but the past decade of these has been pretty consistent and interesting to see as that moves forward. So this brings us to our second polling question of the day before I get to this piece about debt, which is what everybody would like to know, is what percentage of students in the 2022 graduating seniors had more than $200,000, including those that had no debt. It had more than $200,000 in debt. So I apologize for that typo. It's 10%, 26%, 38%, or 43%. These numbers do change quite a bit year to year, and it's really dependent on the number of students that actually have no debt and those things like that. Yeah, graduating seniors specifically from veterinary students. So to clarify that question here. So before we get to that slide, what we actually see is that more graduates are reporting no DVM, no vet school debt. A lot of that has been changing over the years. We kind of saw that at 18% back in 2021. We see that at 20% in 2022. And we are seeing kind of these larger percentages. We're seeing lower percentages of people kind of being in these upper ranges of debt. So more than $200,000 or $300,000 in debt, which is good for affording and signaling for future veterinary students about the cost of veterinary education. But a lot of colleges also tended to freeze their tuition over the last few years, specifically because of COVID and those types of things. And so it's important to realize that cost of education never really decreases. It may stay rather flat. It's just the amount of debt people are taking on and the size of the loans people are taking on to go to school. And so we got some good answers, good response rates on the polling question. What we actually see here is that 38%, so the answer was 38% to that polling question, of the number of students that have over $200,000 in debt. Obviously, that percentage would be much larger if we took out those that had zero debt, and just looking at all the students that took on debt, that would be a larger number. But for the graphic here, that's what it is. And so this was the 2022 graduating class and the amount of debt they took on. We see that this number did decrease. It was around 43% last year in 2021, or the year before, and then now we're more around 38%. So some decreases, but like I said, that will fluctuate year to year. It's completely dependent on a lot of factors that happened at the college level. When we look at salaries for these new starting veterinarians, what we actually see is that their incomes have been increasing over time, which is great news. And what we actually saw was that these numbers really spiked over the last couple of years, but inflation also spiked. And so when we look at real income or real weighted income, what we actually are saying there is we're accounting for inflation. And what does that look like? we actually see that we're back on trend. We kind of lost a lot of income growth, real income growth, back after the Great Recession in that mid 2010 range. And then it's really increased and kind of got us back on track. So we're finally kind of back to that long-term trend, if we didn't have the Great Recession happen back in 07, 09. And so that's been a really positive change for the veterinary industry, because we are seeing those incomes recover and it being a really financially beneficial profession to be a part of, which is great. But $111,242, that was the average starting salary, and that's not accounting for inflation or anything like that, but that's the number that was the average of people getting that. A lot of that's driven by the metropolitan markets, really large cities and things like that. Not so much in the rural spaces and the suburban spaces, but even those saw quite a bit of income growth over the last year. So now we've talked about the new veterinarians, let's jump into the actual market for veterinarians and talk about their salaries and people who have experience and not freshly out of vet school. Similarly to the new veterinarians, what we see with veterinarians with experience is that we did see some salary gains from 2021 to 2022, but inflation's taking a bite out of that. Inflation is still going to affect that when we look at real income. What do we actually feel like we can afford given all these price increases? And what we actually see is that 2022, again, we saw those increases, but it's not as much as we were hoping, given the fact that inflation was such a huge part of 2022. But still some salary gains. What we have seen is, again, this kind of recovery of salaries given the 07 to 09 Great Recession. And we're kind of really more back on trend, looking at being able to have those incomes where we want them to be. So good news there. When we look at unemployment rates and those types of things in veterinary medicine, what we actually see is that the response in unemployment and in the labor force for veterinary medicine tends to lag what's happening in the general economy by up to a year to 2 or 3 years. And so what we actually saw was that our unemployment rates in veterinary medicine are always lower than the general US economy. But that in 2021, that unemployment rate was around 1.8%. And it really declined in 2021 for the general economy and stayed flat into 2022. But for veterinary medicine, we didn't see that decline in unemployment rates until 2022, where we got down to 0.5% of the workforce. And so good news, a lot of people are employed. I think we've all seen that happen. And very few people are just unemployed and can't find a job right now in veterinary medicine, or their preferred job. Some people may be holding out for that as well. And so as we think about going into 2023, that labor market is still, the general US economy labor market is still rather inefficient. A lot of people are switching jobs still, but that's starting to ease up across the economy. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2023 and on into 2024 with unemployment, both in the general economy as well as within veterinary medicine. When we look at those, though, that are not of the unemployed group, a large majority of that unemployed group are actually not even seeking an employment. You're talking almost 80% of the veterinarians and that 0.5% of the entire workforce are not even looking for a job, which is very interesting because this is a trend that's been increasing over time. And these are not people who are retired. They're just unemployed and not looking for a job. And so when we also look at this, some are seeking there's a small percentage trying to get into internships and residency and those types of things. And then some are actively seeking employment in veterinary medicine. But that large portion of people who are veterinarians and unemployed and not looking for work in veterinary medicine has really increased over time. And it's something to think about. How does that why has this changed? Why are we seeing a larger percentage of that group not looking for employment in veterinary medicine? And so things to think about as a larger profession and things we want to know. We can't really say one reason or another. We do see burnout has been a problem in the past, and those types of things. And this is really, they're not looking for employment in veterinary medicine. And we see that a large portion, about 66%, are actually not looking for employment in veterinary medicine of those that are unemployed. Only about 34% are looking for work in veterinary medicine if they're going to go back to work. But on the subject of jobs, what we've really seen over the past few years is this difference in the number of jobs posted by corporate versus independent, small, not necessarily small businesses, but independent and practices, and not under this larger corporate national practice structure. And what we've seen is that up until about mid-2020, they were following pretty steady trends where the corporate consolidator practices were still trying to hire more people than the independent practices. But then we kind of saw this divergence to where the independent practices were still trying to hire the same amount of people month to month. But the corporate consolidator practices really grew in the number of positions they were posting and trying to hire for, which is quite interesting to see over time, and how that has really pushed this labor market for veterinary medicine into the situation that it's kind of in today, where a lot of jobs are posted, and applicants really have a lot of power as they kind of look through and try to find the right position for them. And so it's just an interesting thing to see that. And so this brings us to our third polling question. Before we get there, is what percentage of veterinarians indicated that they are leaving, that they want to leave the veterinary profession in 2022? So this is slight mistype again here, but that indicated they're considering leaving, not that they are leaving. I do apologize about that one, but 25%, 30%, 35%, or 40%. And as we get to that, so again, another good question out there. This does tell us a little bit about the health of the veterinary profession and the workforce and things like that. But as we get into the job concentration and where job applicants are actually applying versus where jobs are being posted for, what we see is that a lot of this follows kind of the major metropolitan areas all across the country, and very specific places where applicants are applying for jobs. What we see is that the red is where there's a lot of people applying, and the blue to gray to blue side is where a lot of people aren't applying, but there are jobs available. And what we actually see is people want to live in these metropolitan areas. They want to live on the East Coast, down in Florida. For those of you who are at VMX, I heard there was a lot of people there, and it seems like everybody wanted to be in Orlando this last week. But California, Arizona, Washington, Colorado, this kind of southeast to central Texas place, which kind of gets Houston to Austin, not quite up into Dallas, but kind of that kind of central Texas space. I'm from Texas, so I can tell you where those counties are. But it's very specific around applicants are really trying to look for very specific places that they want to live and find jobs that align with them. So it's a bit different about, yes, there's a lot of jobs open, but applicants are really looking for very specific places and applying to very specific places rather than others. So the answer to the question here is, so there has been a slight decline. The answer was 40% to that last polling question of people considering leaving the veterinary profession, not those that are leaving. Let me clarify that one more time. What we did see in 2021 was that number was 44%. That has declined to 40% in 2022. Large majority of that is associates. Only about 27% are owners that are considering leaving. And a lot of that, well, it was much higher, as we can see in 2021 and in 2020. A lot of that was driven by the pandemic and the amount of stress going on. We are seeing some of that kind of declining, and business operations getting back to pre-COVID kind of operating procedures in large part, though not everybody is. So that has declined. That's still a larger number than I think we'd all like to see. We would like to see, that number come down moving into the future and keeping as many people in veterinary profession as we can. So that's some good news, only relatively, that we'd still like to see that number come down even more. When we look at that 40% number, though, what's driving, or what groups of people are driving that, we actually see that a lot of it is driven by those that graduated from veterinary school between 2010 and 2019. And so these are people who are relatively new to the profession. Almost half of those considering leaving graduated in the last 10 to 15 years. And so that's something to think about, is why is that group considering leaving more so than other groups, and what can we do to help kind of keep them, and what things need to change in order to make the veterinary profession more appealing to them to stay longer. But interesting to think about. I'll leave that to your own thoughts about, what can we do and why is this happening? Heard a lot of different things going on there from people at various things when I talked about this at VLC and stuff. So that kind of brings me over to the workforce initiatives happening here at the AVMA. We've got a lot of stuff that goes on at AVMA. We are working very diligently to figure out more about the workforce and really understand that on a very deep level. And so when we talk about all these different workforce initiatives, there are some opportunities for you to help us. And I encourage you to always participate where you can and where you feel like it, as well as reach out and see what else is out there for you. One of the big things that we're working on right now, we're in the last phases of recruiting for a trial for veterinary clinics and practices to actually participate in. Burnout has been a topic that we've talked about for many, many years, and I've worked on this topic with AVMA while I was at Cornell, looking at all the different aspects of this. But now we want to get to solutions, and not just solutions for the individual, but solutions for the entire practice. And so we're currently recruiting for a burnout intervention study where your practice can participate. This study is conducted by Cornell. AVMA is not involved in other than funding the study in partnership with Zoetis. And so we are helping with your recruitment, and then the Cornell researchers will take over. But what this is doing is to help tackle burnout from an organizational perspective. And so working predominantly with practice managers, practice owners, to really identify and train them to utilize skills around teamwork and communication and other factors to help create an environment that helps reduce burnout. Now, your whole practice kind of needs to be involved if you are interested in being involved in this. But honestly, the amount of money that it would cost you to do a training like this is, we say $5,000 here, free training. It's really much more than that, because these researchers and professionals at Cornell have worked in industry and worked in the medical field and across a lot of different industries to help reduce burnout, as well as other organizational interventions to tackle other issues as well. And so this is really about creating and training, using a training program to actually solve these burnout problems. And this would be a 3-month intervention. And while you're not having to check in every day, there will be check-ins. But most of the time commitment is up front in the first kind of week or two of the interventions to get trained, to get everybody on board. And then there's check-ins, and then a final kind of wrap up and those types of things at the end there. But if you have any questions, do feel free to reach out to me. The QR code you can capture with your smartphone will take you to the survey link, and we'll ask you a bunch of questions. That all that information gets passed on to Cornell researchers, and they contact you for the next phase of trying to identify the clinics and practices that will be part of the study. And so once you fill this out, I leave you in the hands of some very capable people at Cornell to help you with this. But if you do have questions about it, I am very well versed in this, can kind of give you some more information about it. So feel free to email me. As we saw earlier, some other things we're providing through the AVMA. We talked about the VetSource and AVMA veterinary industry tracker that tracks, this gets updated daily about visits, revenue, parasiticide sales, all various things that go on. It's a great way to keep track of what's going on, and you can look at state by state as well to see how if you want to look more locally down to what you're looking at. And that's all based off of PIMS data. The other thing that AVMA that we put out every month is the practice pulse. And I've been taking I'm the one behind this, writing most of the content, other than I try to translate what's going on in the macroeconomy over the last month. And we also try to provide you some resources about how to deal with those changes and everything going on, as well as point you to some more AVMA resources. So this is great for practice owners, as well as if you're an associate, to kind of just understand what's going on and to give you some more resources that AVMA has to offer, and to keep up with kind of those monthly changes and the constant updates that the macroeconomy kind of throws at us. A couple other things. So we talked about the highlights from the Business and Economic Forum back in October today. If you want to dig more into that information and data, the Economic State of the Profession report, the 2022 report, is out. All the information you saw today, though, will be in the 2023 report, which will hopefully be released in the next couple months. The other thing that we have been really proud of, and one resource that's available to all AVMA members for free, is the language of care work that we have been doing with Melansky and partners. But it's an ebook online that you can download for free if you're an AVMA member, that talks about how to talk about various things with your clients, and how to talk about different types of veterinary care, how to talk about cost, and talk about payment options and those types of things. We are in a phase 2 of the study that really digs more into that cost and payment and cost of care piece that we're very excited about. And a lot of that will come out this year. But check this out. It's a wonderful resource that helps you kind of create communications and talk with also, your clients in a different way. That I've learned a lot, even that I thought about that I wouldn't have picked up on before. And I know a number of veterinarians that have benefited from this as well. So do check that resource out as well. But to bring this home and to really talk about our key takeaways, as we've talked about a lot of different pieces about the veterinary industry, I wanted to give you some key points to talk about, what does this mean for your practice? How do we talk about this type of stuff? And just kind of helping you plan a little bit more for 2023. It may not be perfectly aligned, but it will help with kind of understanding what's going on and giving you some points to bring back. So the one thing I want everybody to keep in mind is that the macroeconomy is dynamic. It changes day to day. I hear different things all the time. I try to help clarify some of that in the practice pulse and in the various presentations I give throughout the year. But really think about what's happening in your local area. How is that affecting your business, and how is that affecting your clients, and all of those things. Just good things to keep in mind as the macroeconomy changes and moves forward in 2023 in one direction or another. And just to keep those things in mind to help your business as well as your clients continue to work really well within veterinary with their pets and their veterinary care. It's important to show that I imagine a lot of you had to deal with price increases this year, and they rose really rapidly over 2022. As much as we want to make sure that we're keeping up with our competition, it's important to remember that making sure that your price increases are in line with the costs, your cost increases, and how's that affecting access to care for your clients. We can, it's a business decision at the end of the day to raise prices to make sure that your business can continue to operate. And I always encourage that. It's just about finding a balance between those things. Demand for pets was not as high as it was expected. Veterinary services definitely changed, but actual number of pets have been kind of up and down over the last few years. The demand for veterinary services, while it's still strong and people are still purchasing veterinary services and more services per pet, what we actually are seeing are people visiting a veterinarian have actually been declining over the last year. And some of that might be a normalization just from the chaos of the pandemic and those few years that we lived through. On the new veterinarian side, most people are still pursuing companion animal and advanced education. And those in advanced education are still kind of aligned with that companion animal piece and sector. For both new veterinarians as well as those that have been in the industry for a bit, salaries are rising, and we're getting back to that pre-Great Recession 07-09 trend. And this is really a long overdue correction. So it's really good to see this happen, and we hope to see continued growth into 2023 and 2024. And then we also see that corporate practices are hiring at higher rates than independent practices, which is really where a lot of that driving force for job postings is, as well as where those jobs are at right now. And that those jobs are really geographically centered around major metropolitan areas and in specific parts of the country. And that's really not a widespread issue, but is really heavy in these other markets. So that's most of what that's all I've got to give you a brief overview. And I think we've got some time for questions. If you'll pop them in the Q&A there, and Adrian and Tesha can help me out.
Well, Clint, your presentation was so thorough and that, no questions yet. But we'll give folks a chance, a few minutes here. We'll see what comes in. There was a dialogue during your presentation, and I think you already addressed the unemployment statistics.
Yeah, got a question here on average transaction numbers declining as well. We don't have data on that specifically. It's a good question, and that's kind of the next piece to look at. What we do see is that if visits are declining, right, the number of transactions probably, we're seeing them more, it's probably equaling out because we're seeing more services or products per client, but less clients coming in the door. So it's kind of that mix of, kind of hard to tell. We will definitely be looking into that this next year as we get more into that data with VetSource. And it looks like 2023 price increases are looking to be aggressive again this year. Interesting. Do you foresee vendors doing double increases in 2023 like most did in 2022? Great question. We've kind of seen that leveling off in price increases towards the last few months. I think everybody's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen over this first quarter of 2023 to see what happens with the economy and the various things going on. I think you'll still see some price increases. I don't think we're out of that realm yet, but doing double increases will be interesting to see. I don't have an answer for you there, but I would be on the lookout for it and figuring out how does that play into my strategy going forward as a business, and what can I do if that happens versus not. So I'd have that strategy in your back pocket. What are we seeing with small animal ER and specialty salaries and caseload? Or any thoughts on the trends for those? So we don't track specifically the ER and specialty stuff. We do see that is where a lot of demand has been the last few years, especially over the pandemic. We saw those salaries increase quite a bit. I think that's where many salaries are increasing, and caseload has been quite high. But again, this is kind of that speculation. We don't track those specifically, but to note that burnout was also much higher for that group than the other groups. From the work that I've done in the past, I suspect that they were squeezed more on caseload than other types. But good to look at. We are looking and thinking about that more as we track data into this year and next year, and good to keep an eye on. So thank you for that. Do you have any reasons for veterinarians wanting to leave the profession? A lot of that has actually come down when we look at this. People wanting to reduce their work hours, change jobs, or leave the profession. A lot of it comes down to work-life balance, burnout, and those types of things as reasons they give us, at least. When we look at that survey, those are the kind of comments we get and what we see as main drivers for that. It's not really much else. Some are injury related. Obviously, if you have an injury and you've been doing a bunch of surgery and you can't do surgery anymore, that might cause you to switch careers or leave the profession, and heard some of that over the last few years, but most of it is driven by work-life balance and burnout. Slides on efficiency. How's the efficiency of a practice evaluated? Set by revenue, client feedback, amount of appointments. Not quite client feedback. So what we look at is revenue generation. We look at staff numbers. We look at a number of things in that space, mostly about the different types of staff, how many you have, and that ratio to veterinarians and other amounts as well. We look at the number of appointments and number of hours worked and all of those pieces. And so those are the big things that we look at with those efficiency numbers. My colleague, Dr. Fred Drogo, is the one who does all of that. A lot of things go into saying what's efficient and that efficiency score they get. It's a model that happens and people get categorized that way, but all of those various things are put in there. So revenue, staff, utilization, and staff numbers, work hours, all of those types of things. When, if at all, do you see the availability of veterinarians catching up with the tremendous need and demand for veterinarians in all sectors? That's a great question. What we actually see, some of that's loosening up. I think macroeconomy is driving some of that because pet owners and general consumers, right, prices are increasing and their disposable income has kind of gone down quite a bit from 2020, 2021. And so I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't quite predict. The joke is that economists, the only people worse at predicting the future than economists or weathermen. And so kind of hard to give you an answer there, but I think that's we're starting to see some of that change in those as the macroeconomy changes, and that really does drive a lot of what happens across the entire sector. A couple more questions. On the burnout intervention survey, do feel free to reach out to me. My email is, I'll make sure everybody has my email and I can give you more details about that, Jane. But do reach out to me and I will give you all that information. And do you have any data or breakout data regarding price increases in certain sectors, small versus mixed versus large, equine, et cetera? Does any sector increase prices more or less than others? We don't break that out. When I've looked at this in particular of biologicals versus pharmaceuticals, we see that pharmaceutical prices are increasing pretty steadily, while biologicals tend to increase a lot more over the last few years. And so depending on, I don't think I'm detailed enough. I don't know enough medicine and veterinary medicine to tell you, is that being utilized, one of those things being utilized more in one sector than another. But I suspect it's really, prices are increasing for cost of goods sold in all aspects, and will continue to be kind of the big topic over the next year as supply chains are still kind of a little wonky, and then dealing also with the various things happening globally.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Neal, for your presentation today. I can't believe you got through all those questions in 5 minutes. And thank you, all of you, for making time in your schedules to join this episode of the Veterinary Practice Health Speaker Series. Please note that CE certificates, if applicable in your state, will be distributed to you in our follow-up communication with you. Please check with your state veterinary medical licensing board for specific CE allowances and requirements. Some boards have limitations on a number of hours accepted in certain categories. They may have restrictions on certain methods of delivery of continuing education. We hope you will join us for our next CE program on March 9th as we co-host with the Veterinary Hospital Manager Association for insight review of benchmarking data collected in 2022 with Dr. Karen Felstead. We will not have a program in February, so the date again is March 9th. This concludes today's webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.